Welcome to my top performance blog. I'm Scott Miller, and today I have the opportunity to speak with my colleague, a friend and fellow researcher, Daryl Chow. Hi, Daryl.
Hey Scott, how are you?
I'm good, and I'm so excited to be able to talk with you about this study that you, together with a bunch of other researchers, including me, have just had published. Tell us about this particular study and the results.
Well, to cut to the chase, the heart of this study was to find out the impact of deliberate practice in our field in psychotherapy. So the main thing that we found was that with a certain framework of deliberate practice as a scaffold, we were able to improve people's response to challenging situations.
Okay, challenging situations like.
So we have a bunch of various situations that clinicians would typically face, but they don't see them often, but they recognize them because it does happen from time to time. So a hopeless presentation, a client who's feeling hopeless, a reluctant client, an angry client, a client who goes into abstraction.
And okay, it's 2024. And the first time this whole idea of difficult conversations in therapy was mentioned that I remember was an article we did called Beyond Measures and Monitoring in
Oh my,
2015. So
oh my.
nine years. What took so darn long?
Yeah, we're twiddling our thumbs one way now, but the reason it took really long was that we started off initially at that time, right, 2014, 2015, just right after that deliberate practice study that we did, we were chasing another thing, which was this idea of the difficult conversations therapy. And we did a pilot study at that time. So it was just 10 people, if I recall, and we were just grinding it down together, especially with Dr. Sharon Liu. And we were trying to figure out if we could guide people with a challenging scenario. And that was just an initial pilot. The one that you are referring to, a randomized version of that, where you had a control group and experimental group for that.
Okay, and it did take a while to get published. And there are two things I want to talk about with regard to that, because it seems to me that part of the difficulty in getting published was this a bit of a debate about what is deliberate practice in psychotherapy. So, can you just give the highlights about that? What needs to be present in a study
Yeah.
to be a test of the deliberate practice idea? That is, that if people reach for an objective just beyond their current ability,
Yeah.
that they can improve their effectiveness or their performance. What are the components?
Yeah, I think before what are the components, I think there was a misunderstanding even at the initial stage about deliberate practice. And that's because when they looked at our study on the surface level of the 2014 DP study in psychotherapy, they thought it was just purely about the number of hours that was spent, right, on that. But bearing in mind that at that time when we were doing it together with you, Scott, the main thing we were still trying to take a discovery oriented approach. And we're just trying to understand the landscape of where this is. And one of the factors that came out was that amount of time spent was a significant variable when we control a multi-level model of different things. But this was not new to people like K. Anders Ericsson, the late K. Anders Ericsson, who studied people in the field of expertise. And this from time to time, this usually comes up as well about the amount of devoted specific time. The thing that you and I, along with our colleagues Mark Hubble and all, we were trying to argue that perhaps we need to have some kind of consensus or a working definition of what this is. We didn't really reinvent the wheel, but we just put them into a little pyramid, a four pyramid thing, which was the four pillars of DP. Building on Ericsson's work was a coach, somebody who can guide you to push you to your edge of your ability, somebody who can help you with your individualized learning objectives, and then three, to have an environment of learning feedback, and finally, fourth is to have some kind of successive refinement. We used to call it repetition, right? But we thought it was more nuanced to just call it successive refinement because it's little tweaks, little adjustments. It's not just reps, so to speak.
And in the article that just came out, the research that people are claiming is deliberate practice. There are now more studies coming
Mm.
out,
Yeah.
but am I right to say that this particular study is really the first to meet all four criteria for deliberate practice?
I think that was what we're trying to argue for. I mean, barring the fact that we did this some time ago, but even that, like we wanted to make sure that what if we could have all these components involved in the design? So again, somebody to guide each individual participant, each individual therapist to their edge of ability rather than like a general kind of like this is what you should say or not sort of thing, and then you repeat. No, it was specific to how they were doing it. Then we'd kind of develop towards their edge, help them with some feedback, some principle guided feedback. Maybe we will get into that a little bit. And then they get to repeat that in the scenario. And when we change the scenario, we wanted to see if they could generalize that learning to other situations.
Okay. And so I'm thinking of the practical applications of these findings
Yeah.
with therapists that are intrigued by the idea of DP.
Yeah.
Much of what is discussed when I read about DP is what I think Erickson would call purposeful practice. Purposeful practice being that there's a certain criterion level of performance. I think most of us are familiar with this when learning to drive. The idea is not to become Mario Andretti or some famous race car driver, but really to be proficient, not to get into crashes, to follow the basic laws. And so purposeful practice is what I see a great deal of, and
Mhm.
therapists often report to me that they find the process a little boring, that after a while, there's not much reward in it. So help us make the connection between this particular study and what therapists can do to keep their deliberate practice efforts alive.
That's a big question. I think that's often the thing that we are thinking about how that actually can help people translate into stuff that they can do. And I think, I mean, one of the clear implication about this is the quality of the feedback determines the quality of the learning.
Hmm.
So in the study, we had a control group, so they saw the same challenges and they were trying to do the thing on their own. So, i.e., self-reflection, right? I think
Hmm.
it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And in the results, it's shown that people in the control group, as they were trying to work through on their own, majority of them didn't get better. Only about 10% of them actually did improve on their own.
Hmm.
And then for the for the experimental group or the feedback group, we had the majority of them who actually improved. But many of them reported ratings of difficulty, that they found it more difficult and more challenging in spite of the fact that they were improving.
Hmm.
So, back to your question, I think that means that we do need space to reflect, but we do need the guidance of someone who can understand the way that we do and help us to pinpoint specific aspects to work on. But
Hmm.
if I may just stress this point, yeah, the issue, Atu Gwande, a surgeon, as you know, he raised this distinction between ignorance and ineptitude. So he was thinking about the medical profession. He says that the issue is not ignorance. It's not that we don't know things, is ineptitude. And his
Hmm.
definition of ineptitude is like not knowing out of the complexity of different things. When do I need to apply certain things? What do I need to forego? Where do I zoom in? When do
Hmm.
I zoom out? So
Hmm.
those aspects, I think, if somebody could guide to help you in the actual conversational nature of therapy,
Hmm. Hmm.
as opposed to theoretical abstractions of discussion, like actually how you might relate, engage, and move the conversation further is important. That's one of the big ones.
And it seems to me then the way you're describing this is that even though people find in response to feedback that the task becomes more challenging or difficult, or that the variety of choices become more apparent. Oh my gosh, I could go in a million different directions.
Yeah.
What deliberate practice and environment targeted feedback provides over time is a more complex cognitive map that not only do you have more choices, but you get a sense of when to do what with whom, and also how to combine these skills in unique ways if it doesn't happen to fit the exact parameters of your map. Am I overstating this?
No, I think you're spot on. So one of the things you and I have been doing in DP trainings, it has been about the idea of developing baselines, right? So people understand baselines as your aggregated performance and all that. That's like one facet. But the other thing that you and I have been doing was talking about developing their own framework, their own blueprint, just as a rough mental construction of how they do. Imagine explaining this to someone. And that has been a challenge for a lot of people. And
Hmm,
I think there's a psychological reason for that. I mean, the things that we do implicitly or tacitly, we're not so conscious. We just, we do things quite intuitively. And that's
hmm,
fine. That's actually not the issue.
hmm,
But if one wants to level up or improve a little bit, we have to make the things that are unconscious to become slightly conscious,
hmm,
not to stay there, so that we can break what Erickson would call the automaticity and then go back to doing the things that we do.
hmm, hmm. And what I start to think about when you mention this is an experience that we had somewhere along the way while doing the study.
Mm.
And then we would try to teach these things at a, say, DP intensive workshop,
Yeah.
that you'd show the difficult scenario, and then you would help people understand where their response might be improved. But then many participants would say something like, just tell us the answer you're looking for. Just tell us what to say and we'll say it. Can you comment a bit about this? Because it seems that in addition to boredom, just the frustration involved in mastering this new way of working or pushing the boundaries of your way of working can be defeating.
Can be defeating exactly, and it bears out in the study that we did too, that the attrition rates was slightly higher for people in the feedback group because it's hard work. You're pushing towards your things that you do by default. So yeah, there's a level of tenacity that you're gonna need for it. There's some predisposition that you need to know that you'll be challenged. But I think that the greatest challenge, like is this. We're not trying to reach for the right answer, meaning we're not trying to perform. We're trying to develop.
Hmm,
Right? So the distinction is important because one that comes from a framework of performance, and as a Singaporean Asian, that's a big thing for me growing up. It's always like getting the right results and getting the good answers for math. But that's very different because now what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out your own ability and what's possible and not be too invested if you make a mistake. So one of the facets of perfectionism, if you zoom in a little bit, it is this over concern of faltering, over concern of making mistakes, because we get over identified with like, oh my
hmm,
goodness, it's like I screwed up or something, right?
hmm,
But what we found was that those who are receptive, those who are like, yeah, game on, okay, ouch, but let's try again. And we work through them. And then the agony of the fact that we're not telling them what to respond, we're going, can you think about this from this principle? Can you think about this from this principle? Then they're like, ugh, yeah.
Okay. So I imagine that there are many who are listening in who are intrigued by deliberate practice. They may be trying their hand at it, but they don't have access to these carefully curated films that were created for, say, the DP project. Again, a difficult or a challenging scenario, a hopeless client, an angry client, a reluctant client. And what do you say to connect and engage and improve the chances that they will stay with you for the change project? So, is there something practically speaking that clinicians could do to replicate this in their own work? Or is it really about finding a coach? What would be the steps, Daryl?
I think it's not either or, it's probably both. And I mean, one, the DCT videos are actually made available, so we've got them. The scenarios that was professionally done, we kind of uploaded. But I think it's misleading to think that those things are the key. Those
Mm,
are just a stimulus to kind of kick you off.
mm,
So, what I would suggest in general, I think it is important for people, is to consider the idea of developing their own native learning labs. Meaning, in your work situation, if you work in in the community, you work in private practice, you work in student counseling, you know, if you are working there for some time, or if you ask those who's been around more than you get a sense that there is sort of a theme of the kinds of challenges one would face, right? And I would say, and actually Erickson was the one who suggested to us quite early, I think this was in 2010. He suggested that it's good to kind of develop, he called it like an archive of like scenarios. And I thought, what a brilliant idea. And why are we doing that? But I thought more pointedly, we should build a repertoire of the kinds of challenges that we would normally face, specific challenges. The thing is, if you get good with challenges, you get more comfortable in your own seat and your own skin, right?
mm,
That's the first step. Develop your own sort of repertoire of various scenarios. And
mm,
then if you're in a team, build that up and have a discussion on those things, and then start to play around about the process knowledge, not just about the content of stuff, but like how do we engage? Like you said, Scott, like do you have a representational map on how to deal with such situations, right? So one of the limitations in our study, which we were critiqued quite a bit, I called it a creative constraint because one of the constraints was the pilot study, though it was done in real time, we thought it would be kind of interesting if it was purely in longhand or they wrote it out. I
mm,
thought it was important because it got them out of the performing zone and got them just into exactly just to think through on their own without worrying about how they're sounding and all, but just really develop that inner map first.
mm,
Of course, it's still a constraint. It's a constraint because well, it's not how they were going to speak and so on. But I think it's an important step to be able to write
mm,
that down. So back
mm,
to your question, then I think it would be good to develop sort of how they would normally say it as their baseline, but then okay, maybe learn from other people how they say it and try and extrapolate the essence, the principles behind that,
mm,
and try to tweak, tweak, and then ultimately the aim is that you get to develop your own principles that will guide you in your work.
mm. Perfect. Hey, Daryl, thanks for speaking with me. I know that people can catch you on the web. I'm going to put the link down here at the bottom and also in the two books that we've done, really kind of in the last 2 years. So both Better Results and then the follow-up volume called The Field Guide to Better Results. We were very lucky to secure the participation of many of the field's leading researchers to contribute chapters helping explicate exercises for each of the factors that have leverage on the outcome of the helping relationship. So in any event, thanks, Daryl. Very excited to see this study come out.
Finally, thanks for having me.
Take care.